Hello and welcome to the channel Echoes Shadows. Imagine working alone in the silence of the night, surrounded by shadows. Now, imagine when those shadows pin you against the wall. Today, we're going to share 4 real stories of security guards who faced the unexplainable. Stay until the end and find out what they experienced. Leave a comment if you've ever had an unexplainable experience. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming stories. Thank you very much. Story 1. The Midnight Shift.
My name's Mike, and I live in a small town called Waverly in Ohio. I've been working as a night security guard at a warehouse just outside of town for about 3 years now. The job's usually pretty quiet, and I've always liked that. It gives me time to catch up on podcasts or scroll through my phone, and for the most part, I've never had any issues. That was until one night that completely changed the way I feel about this job. It was a Friday, and I was already pretty tired after a long week. My girlfriend had gone out of town to visit her mom, so I was feeling kind of down but ready to get through another routine night shift. The warehouse was in a pretty isolated spot, far from the town's main area. That night, things felt different from the start. There wasn't much going on, and I didn't think much of it at the time. I clocked in, did my usual rounds, checking the gates and monitoring the cameras. All seemed fine. Around midnight, I noticed something strange on the cameras. On one of the screens near the main gate, I saw a figure standing still in one of the darker corners. It was like a shadow, but denser, darker than the night itself. At first, I thought it might be a glitch with the old camera, but when I looked back, it was gone, just like that. The figure vanished, but the chill that went down my spine stayed. I shook it off and kept working, but the atmosphere had shifted. The place felt heavier, more oppressive. I went to the guard booth to grab some coffee, and as I came back, I heard footsteps outside. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but the footsteps kept echoing through the empty parking lot. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to check. The air was completely still, not a sound, nothing moving. And then I saw it. Near the far end of the lot, by one of the parked trucks, there was a person, or at least something that looked like a person just standing there, arms straight down by its sides. But the way it stood, it wasn't right. Something about its shape, its presence made my skin crawl. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. The figure didn't move. I started walking closer, heart racing, hands shaking. As I got nearer, I realized this wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It had no face, just a blank, dark shape standing there. And then it turned towards me, like it had just noticed I was there. Slowly, it started moving in my direction. I froze. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. All I felt was this intense cold washing over me, but it wasn't the kind of cold you feel on your skin. It was deeper, more unsettling. The thing got closer, and something in me finally clicked. I ran. I sprinted back to the guard booth, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so bad I almost broke the lock. I turned on all the lights and just stood there, sweating and shaking, waiting for it to show up again. But it didn't. The feeling that I wasn't alone, though, that stayed. I was convinced that if I turned around, it would be right there, watching me. I checked the cameras again, trying to calm myself down, but now every screen was filled with static, just white noise and interference. In between the static, I could make out shadows, moving fast, darting across the screen, but I couldn't make out what they were. I grabbed my radio, desperate to call my supervisor, but all I got was static. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time they weren't outside. They were inside the booth with me. I looked around, but there was nothing there. The sound kept getting louder, like it was circling around me, coming closer and closer. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. When I finally checked my watch again, it was almost 6 in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise, and that heavy, oppressive feeling that had been suffocating me all night, it was gone, just like that. When the morning guard showed up, I didn't say a word. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. I still don't. I just got out of there as fast as I could. To this day, I avoid driving by that warehouse. I don't know if I saw something real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, But that night, it's burned into my memory. I'll never forget it.
Story 2. The Hidden Presence.
My name is John, and I live in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I've been working as a night security guard in a commercial building downtown for about 3 years. Everything had always been routine, up until one night that completely changed how I see this job. It was a Wednesday, and my shift started off quietly. The building was right in the middle of the city, but since it was late at night, the streets were mostly empty. I clocked in at 10 p.m. and did my usual rounds, checking the doors, the parking lot, and all the floors. The place was big, with several offices that were empty at night. The silence in those corridors could get pretty eerie, but I'd gotten used to it, at least until that night. It all started when I was on the 3rd floor. I was checking one of the offices when I heard a noise. It was faint, like something being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it might be someone staying late, but when I went to check, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the sound kept going. It seemed to come from one of the closed offices. My heart started racing, but I kept my cool and followed the sound. When I reached the door, the noise stopped. I opened it slowly, peeking inside. Everything looked normal. Desks, chairs, all in place. I figured it was just my imagination. I closed the door and turned to leave, but then I felt it. A cold touch on the back of my neck. A shiver shot down my spine and I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was still empty. I tried to shake off the fear, but something was off that night. I moved on to the next floor, trying to focus on my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. On the 4th floor, as I was walking down the hallway, I felt it again. This time, a cold grip on my arm. It was like an icy hand was holding me in place. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was completely frozen for what felt like an eternity, with nothing but that cold, invisible force gripping me. And then I heard whispering. Low, soft voices circling me, but I couldn't understand them. The hallway, which had been empty moments ago, suddenly felt crowded with unseen figures. My heart pounded as a door at the end of the hallway slammed shut, with no one there to close it. At that point, I finally regained control of my body. My legs felt weak, but I knew I had to get out of there. I headed for the stairs, ready to head back to the front desk. But just as I reached the stairwell, I saw it. A figure at the end of the hallway. It was a shadow, shapeless, but I could feel it staring right at me. My heart raced and I froze again, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, but the air around me felt thick, like it was suffocating me. Before I could figure out what to do, the shadow began moving towards me. I wanted to run, but my legs were heavy, as if something was pulling me back. When I finally managed to break free, I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, nearly tripping over the steps. I didn't stop until I reached the front desk, where I locked the door behind me. I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. But even after hours passed, the feeling of being watched never went away. As the sun finally started to rise, that oppressive presence seemed to disappear. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But ever since that night, every time I walk past the 4th floor, I feel that same coldness, like something is still waiting for me. I've never seen the shadow again, but that night left a mark on me. Now every shift, I'm always on edge, waiting for something to show up again. Something I can't see but can feel lurking in the dark. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to find out what it is.
Story 3. The Cold Grip.
My name is Mike, and I live in Cleveland, Ohio. I've been working as a night security guard for 6 years now. I had gotten used to the quiet and isolation of the job, but one night at an old abandoned paper mill changed everything for me. The mill was located off a deserted highway, far from the city, in the middle of nowhere. It had been shut down for years, but for some reason, the security company I worked for still kept guards on site. That night, it was my turn to watch the place. The shift started normally, like always. My first round was uneventful, just walking between rusted machines, dusty corridors, and the musty smell of decay. But after midnight, things took a turn. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. They were fast, like someone running, but the sound came from the floor above me. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. The stairs creaked under my weight as I reached the hallway. Silence. I was about to head back when I heard a loud thud. It was a heavy noise, like something big had fallen. I rushed to an office with its door slightly open. Inside, everything was overturned. Desks, chairs, all in disarray. But what made my blood run cold were the footprints in the dust on the floor. They were huge, larger than any person's, and incomplete, like they belonged to something that didn't walk on normal feet. Fear started creeping in, but I kept going. As I descended the stairs, a freezing wind blew past me, something that shouldn't have been possible since all the windows were sealed shut. The feeling that I wasn't alone settled in, heavy and cold. I went back to the control room where I had left my things, and that's when I saw the first truly bizarre thing. One of the cameras, which showed a central hallway, displayed something I couldn't explain. A shadow was standing in the middle of the corridor. It wasn't a person, it didn't have a shape, it was just a black mass, motionless. I stood up to go check it out, but the moment I approached the screen, the shadow moved, fast, out of the camera's view. My heart pounded, but I couldn't back down now. I grabbed the flashlight again and headed to the hallway. Everything seemed normal, empty. But suddenly, one of the office doors slammed shut with such force that the echo shook the whole floor. The sound was deafening, and the air around me grew thick, almost like I couldn't breathe. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt it again. A presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, and there it was. A tall figure, shrouded in dark mist, without a face. It was like a solid shadow, hovering in the middle of the hallway. My body froze. I couldn't move or speak. The figure started inching closer, and all I could think was that I wasn't getting out of this unscathed. As it approached, the lights above began flickering. The shadow extended an arm toward me, and in that instant, something unseen shoved me hard against the wall. I was pinned there, unable to move, as a cold like I'd never felt before pressed into my skin. As I struggled to break free, objects around me started flying off the shelves. Boxes, metal parts, everything was floating, spinning in the air. A chair flew right past my head, missing me by inches. Panic surged through me, but my body was still paralyzed, as if the entire mill itself had come alive and was holding me there. Then, just as suddenly, the figure vanished, disappearing into thin air, but the pressure on me remained. That's when I felt something even worse. A cold hand grabbed my ankle, squeezing tightly. I looked down and saw nothing, but I could feel it, fingers pressing into my skin. I tried to pull my leg free, but the grip only tightened. At that moment, real terror set in. I was trapped, alone, with something that I couldn't see or fight. After what felt like an eternity, the hand finally let go, and I collapsed to the floor, shaking, but I didn't have time to recover. The lights flickered again, and from one of the nearby rooms, I heard a scream. It was high-pitched, full of agony, like someone was in pain. I ran toward the sound, but when I got to the door, everything went quiet again. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and left, not even waiting for my shift to end. I never went back to that mill, and every time I drive past it, I still get chills down my spine. I know what happened that night was real, and whatever it was, it's still trapped in that place. And the worst part is, I don't think it wants to stay there alone.
Story 4. The Echo of Darkness.
My name is Mark, and I've been a security guard for almost 8 years. I've seen all kinds of things in this line of work, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night at an old textile factory in Detroit. My partner Jake and I had just started our shift, and right from the beginning, the place felt off. The air was heavy, the silence suffocating, and the constant feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Little did we know, that night would change our lives forever. The factory was a massive building with broken windows and endless hallways. It had been abandoned for decades, but we were hired to watch over it after local residents reported hearing strange noises coming from inside. During our first round, we already knew something was wrong. The doors on the second floor slammed shut by themselves, even though there was no wind. Jake, always the skeptic, brushed it off as nothing. But there was no breeze at all that night. It was around 2 a.m. when we heard heavy footsteps coming from an area we knew was completely empty. At first, we thought it might be an intruder, so we went to check it out. We grabbed our flashlights and followed the sound. But as we got closer, the footsteps sped up, like something was running from us. When we reached the hallway where the sounds had been coming from, it was empty. Jake shined his light on the ground and saw the marks, footprints. But they were huge, far too big to belong to a person, and they were spaced oddly, as if whatever made them had been dragging something behind it. That's when we heard the first voice, a whisper, faint but clear, coming from all directions at once. It was as if someone was speaking right into our ears, but there was no one there. "You hear that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, feeling the fear tighten in my chest. We were surrounded by something we couldn't see. As we started heading back to the control room, things got worse. The lights in the corridor began to flicker violently, and at the far end, we saw a figure. At first, it looked like a person, tall, thin, but with arms that seemed unnaturally long. It stood still, just watching us. Jake called out, but there was no response. The figure then took a step forward, and the lights went out completely. We were plunged into total darkness. Jake turned on his flashlight, and when the beam hit the wall, we saw something that chilled us to the bone. Words were scrawled all over the length of the corridor. "Leave. They're here. And the most disturbing, you're next." Jake started walking faster, but I couldn't move. That's when something grabbed the back of my jacket, pulling hard. There was no one behind me, but I could feel cold fingers gripping me. I tried to break free, but it was like an invisible hand was holding me in place. Jake started pulling me, shouting for us to get out. When I finally broke free, we ran down the stairs. But as we descended, a horrible sound echoed from above, like claws scraping against the walls, followed by a scream that made our blood run cold. The sound got closer and closer, like something was chasing us. We made it to the control room, slammed the door shut, and tried to call the main office, but the radios were dead and our phones had no signal. The silence that followed was unbearable. We sat there, breathing heavily, when suddenly the radio crackled to life. We thought it was someone from the office, but the voice that came through wasn't human. It was a mix of whispers and screams, a chaotic noise that I won't even try to describe. The chairs in the room began to move on their own, dragging across the floor with a loud screech. Before we could react, an unseen force lifted Jake off the ground and pinned him against the wall. I was frozen in place. I watched as Jake struggled against it, but there was nothing there, just the heavy air and a bone-chilling cold that filled the room. Then, the windows shattered all at once, glass flying in every direction. Whatever was in that room was toying with us. That's when I felt it. Cold hands grabbing my shoulders, locking me in place. It felt like 1,000 fingers were holding me down. My muscles locked up, and all I could do was watch as Jake was thrown to the ground, hard. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then as quickly as it started, it all stopped. The chairs stopped moving, the air lightened, and Jake dropped to the floor, gasping for breath. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but everything was still. We grabbed our things and ran out of that factory, not daring to look back. I never went back there again. Jake quit the job soon after. To this day, I don't know what we faced that night, but one thing's for sure. Whatever it wasn't from this world. And the worst part? I don't think it wants to stay there alone.